Look, thanks very much to the Association of Foreign Affairs, the Malmö Association of Foreign Affairs, and also to all those who are attending today. I'm going to make a few observations and some opening remarks first before I get into the meat of the presentation. The opening remark that I would make is that everything I talk about today, the commentary I offer, and particularly the opinions that I give and the answers to questions that I'll field will be my own opinion or my own perspective on things. And it won't represent necessarily any of the organisations that I represent, either that being the Australian Defence Force, Lund University, the Oxford Association for Global Ethics and Human Rights, or anyone else that I'm affiliated with. So they are going to be my own particular perspectives on things, and I would just ask you to take that in mind. I guess one of the key things I wanted to touch on in opening remarks was that this year represents the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And so in light of that, I would put to you that the topic of sexual violence in context of conflict remains as relevant as ever. And sexual violence continues to be widespread in conflict-affected environments, but it shouldn't be regarded as a symptom of war or evidence of violent excess. And I know that particular comment was made actually in the Facebook post for this event. Sexual violence can significantly exacerbate situations of armed conflict and crisis, and it impedes the restoration of international peace and security. And it is a direct attack on the human dignity and fundamental human rights. Prior to getting into the meat again in opening commentary here, what I wanted to offer to you was a story that particularly touched me. And so it's a little bit of a confronting story, but I'm going to share it with people just to provide a narrative around perhaps why I care so much about this particular issue. So from that perspective there, I'm going to share the story of Mary. And Mary was a woman in South Sudan. And as I mentioned, this is a confronting story. So for those who want to take a minute or so to walk away from their computers, they can do so. But effectively, Mary was a lady living in a village. She was a Nuer woman. And so in the context of South Sudan, the Dinka and Nuer were the two major tribal groups involved in the non-international armed conflict in the South Sudan. And in Mary's case, an attack occurred on her village. She initially fled the attack, but unfortunately was captured. And indeed, soldiers from the South Sudanese People's Liberation Army at the time killed her husband. They killed her two sons, aged 5 and 7. And then 5 soldiers proceeded to hold Mary down and forced her to watch as 3 others raped her 10-year-old daughter. And her daughter's name was Nylat. After the men had completed raping Nylat, the 5 who were holding her down turned their attentions towards Mary and raped her. And unfortunately, Nylat died a few hours later. And Mary's quoted as saying there that when that occurred, she wanted to die too. That's but one example of how sexual violence can affect an individual in the context of an armed conflict. But obviously the situation is much broader than just one individual story. But I would ask you to, when you think about all of the particular topics that I raised today, all of the particular theories that I throw at you, all of the terminology, and all of those ideas, that just hold Mary in the back of your mind and think about the fact that this is not just merely a theoretical thing that we're talking about here. This is not just merely an existential exercise. This indeed really does affect real people. And indeed, it actually is stories like these from my time in the UN mission in the South Sudan that actually filled me with anger and frustration. And indeed, the feeling was pretty strong and pretty visceral. We had a mandate to provide protection to civilians, and yet we as an international community, at least in my eyes, we're not able to do that, and indeed to this day struggle to be able to provide protection to civilians in a number of different conflicts. And I'd put to you that this was probably my tipping point to transition from a military career to a career in the law, focusing upon human rights and international humanitarian law. And so with those the sort of opening remarks done, I wanted to sort of delve into a bit of an introductory overview to conflict-related sexual violence, to sexual violence in conflict, and to sexual and gender-based violence. What we're going to do when we talk about sexual and gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence is apply a women, peace and security lens to this. Now, for those students who are in the audience, who are in particular who are studying international relations, development studies, peace and conflict studies and human rights, if you haven't come across the Women, Peace and Security agenda yet, I'd put to you that you definitely should make yourself aware of the agenda, of what it means, and indeed UN Security Council Resolution 1325 of the year 2000 and all of its associated resolutions. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is fundamental to our considerations of sexual violence in the context of conflict. And I'll get to that and why that is in a second. But what I will say is that what the Women, Peace and Security agenda does is it accounts for a gender perspective. The gender perspective looks effectively at accounting for the impacts of armed conflict and indeed the impacts of anything based upon how it affects men, women, boys and girls, and understanding that those impacts may be disproportionate. They may not affect everyone equally. In that respect there, I would also put to you as well that the Women, Peace and Security agenda links to the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. And indeed, the majority, there is also an obligation on nations as well to develop national action plans. And so you may wish to, at the end of this particular lecture, look to see if the country you come from has a national action plan for women, peace and security. It's interesting to delve into that and to read as to what your particular nation may be doing in terms of implementing the WPS agenda and the outcomes of not only Resolution 1325, but all those associated to it. I'd also say as well that focusing today on sexual and gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence is a complementary exercise to the overall goal of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And that overall goal is ultimately gender equality, women's participation in peace and security, and the integration of a gender perspective towards gender mainstreaming. When I talk today and we get into the meat of the real meat of the presentation next, when we talk about defining sexual violence in conflict and then looking at its effects, I'm going to focus upon international human rights law principles. I'll also look at international humanitarian law principles. I'll look at the impact of international criminal law and also the applicability of domestic laws. I am a lawyer, so I think about it in that context, but what I'm not going to do is throw a whole bunch of law at you. I want to draw out practical examples based upon my military experience, my field experience, as much as I do these other principles as well. But I would put to you that some of the principles that you should consider in terms of international human rights law when it comes to the issue of sexual violence, and in particular the issue of sexual violence in armed conflicts, is such things as a prohibition against torture, the prohibition against slavery, and indeed CEDAW as well, which is the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. In terms of international humanitarian law, we look there at principles or indeed the Geneva Conventions of 1949. And when we consider acts of sexual violence, we look at the violations of international humanitarian law in that respect, which leads into international criminal law, which international criminal law is effectively the actual, whilst the acts in terms of what is prohibited in terms of warfare and armed conflict is contained within international humanitarian law. The idea of international criminal law then is to actually look at classifying those crimes and indeed pursuing criminal responsibility. Fundamental to that would be the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, but also the statutes of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, to name but a few. But ultimately, what that leads us to in terms of international law is the fundamental understanding that sexual violence in the context of armed conflict represents crimes against humanity, war crimes, and indeed the constituent crimes to the crimes of genocide. In terms of applicability of domestic laws, and I'll just touch on this just briefly for you, what we consider in terms of sexual in the context of armed conflict is not only the domestic laws of the jurisdiction in which the armed conflict is taking place, but also the extraterritorial laws that apply to a particular armed force that are operating overseas as well. Okay, enough with that sort of heavy component of law in there for you, but I just want to frame it against that as we now talk into defining sexual violence in conflict. So, sexual and gender-based violence. What does this term really mean? I'll put it to you that sexual and gender-based violence looks at violence that targets individuals or indeed groups on the basis of their gender. And it includes inflicting physical, mental or sexual harm or suffering and the threat of such acts and coercion and deprivation of liberty. So in terms of gender-based violence, there are 5 different types: physical violence, emotional and psychological violence, harmful traditional practices, socioeconomic violence, and indeed sexual violence. Looking at conflict-related sexual violence, so conflict-related sexual violence is a term that is a United Nations term, and what it does is it looks to define or looks to capture sexual violence that is committed in the context of an armed conflict that has a nexus to an armed conflict. So in that context there is a synergy between sexual and gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence, but it's important to understand that sexual and gender-based violence can occur outside the context of an armed conflict. It can occur in the same geographical location and the same time period as an armed conflict, but it may be outside of an armed conflict. So in that case there, you would think, for example, to intimate partner violence, violence between a man to his wife, a man to his child, and so on and so forth. Would be a case of sexual and gender-based violence, perhaps, but wouldn't necessarily constitute conflict-related sexual violence. There is a small distinction between the two, but I would also put to you that that broadly, when we talk about armed conflict, we talk about gripping up a number of different issues of sexual violence under the context of sexual and gender-based violence or conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. And indeed, conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence is the term that NATO use. Looking at conflict-related sexual violence, there are 3 aspects to this. There is actually the act of sexual violence itself. There is then the status of the perpetrator and or the victim, and also that nexus to a conflict. And that nexus to a conflict is about when we establish a political or strategic objective for the use of sexual violence in the context of an armed conflict. When it comes to the actual acts of sexual violence we're talking about here, we're talking about effectively every manner of act that we've seen in more recent conflicts, certainly that we've seen in conflicts in Syria, the conflict in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Mali, in Nigeria, in Sudan, South Sudan, and so on and so forth. And that pertains to, quite obviously, rape, but also sexual assault, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, enforced sterilisation, and forced marriage, to name but a few. And there are broader definitions for that, and there are more restrictive definitions. What I've gone with there is effectively what is considered to be jurisprudence coming out of international courts. Again, I'll try and stick away from the law from this perspective, from this point onwards, but just it's impossible, being a lawyer, not to sort of delve into that a little bit. What is really important about the Women, Peace and Security agenda when it comes to conflict-related sexual violence is indeed UN Security Council Resolution 18 of the year 2008. Security Council Resolution 1820 recognises that women and girls are disproportionately impacted and particularly targeted by the use of sexual violence. But moreover, 1820 is the first time in which the international community stood up and said that sexual violence can be utilised as a tactic of warfare. Sexual violence has been something that has been utilised throughout millennia, has been consistent with warfare and armed conflict for a significant period of time. But it's not until 2008 that the Security Council releases that particular resolution as part of the broader Women, Peace and Security agenda, that the international community puts it in such terms, unequivocal terms, from a body such as the United Nations Security Council. And this is important. This has occurred because of the lobbying and the good work of a number of different of peoples, most notably here the feminism movement, and those who recognise that the use of sexual violence indeed destabilises societies, but also directly impacts the opportunities that women and girls have to be able to achieve gender equality. And so we link then again this idea of gender equality to the use of sexual violence. In terms of how sexual violence is then sort of addressed in armed conflict, I'm going to get in a second to talking about there's different types of dominant patterns of sexual violence, and provide you some really practical examples for how that's used. Some of that based upon my own experience, but also based upon reporting that I've seen as well. And I will endeavour here to provide some detail, and hopefully what that will do is to generate some questions that will come out of you guys that you'll want to follow up on when we about the use of the dominant patterns of sexual violence. What I then also want to do is I'll then go and talk about the impacts that this has on survivors, the impacts that this has on the society, and on the perpetuation of conflict. So I've talked to you about UN Security Council Resolution 1820, and I've mentioned to you that it is used. It defines, or it is the first time in which the international community has stood up and said that sexual violence can be used as a tactic of war. And the actual Security Council resolution talks to the idea of the sexual violence being used as a tactic of war to humiliate, to dominate, to instill fear, and to disperse or displace civilians. But I would put to you also that the individual motivations for the use of sexual violence may be many and also varied. But if you apply positivist observational theories on the use of sexual violence, you can draw some dominant patterns. And in drawing some dominant patterns, what I'll also do is talk to how this links to factors of human security more broadly. Factors of human security as a terminology refers to the concept of individuals and how secure they feel in their society. And when you measure factors of human security, what you're really looking at there is factors to do with, does a person have physical security? Do they have shelter? Do they have access to potable water? Do they have access to sanitation? Do they have access to a reliable food source? Do they have access to economic opportunity? Do they have access to education? And do they have access to health? And so as I talk through some of this now, and as I break down some practical examples, have in the back of your mind as well that these particular examples likely affect and impact some of these factors of human security in much the same way as we see right now the effect of COVID-19 and the global pandemic in society is affecting those factors of human security for individuals. The same can be true for the use of sexual violence. So there are three main dominant patterns when it comes to sexual violence that I'll draw out for you today. And the first is the idea of sexual violence used as a strategy of warfare. And so in that context there, what I'm talking about is the use of sexual violence to target a particular ethnic group, to threaten civilians, to dehumanise an adversary, and also to target enemies' will to fight. And often when I was teaching gender and military operations to Australian soldiers and coalition soldiers, what I would talk about when it comes to targeting and will to fight would be that I would put them very difficult for them to deploy forward into a location and to be able to accept the mission that they were on and to be able to execute that mission. If they knew themselves that armed groups or another adversary were indeed going into their families' homes and perpetrating acts of sexual violence against their families back in their own communities. And in the context, this is particularly prevalent in the context of non-international armed conflict. So in the context of non-international armed conflict, which is effectively civil wars, or wars contained to not that war not of international character there. The ability to be able to target an enemy's will to fight through the use of sexual violence is significant. Affects morale, stabilises an armed group, and so on and so forth when they are aware this is being utilised. Now, that said, this is a double-edged sword, because whilst you might target an enemy's will to fight and indeed be effective in doing so, you may also steal an enemy's resolve by the use of sexual violence in that context as well. So it isn't as simple as saying it's one way or it's one way. It could be used, it could go either way in that respect. When we talk about this as a strategy of warfare and some practical examples here, I'll point to my experience in the South Sudan. UN reporting indicates that 67% of all cases of sexual violence in the context of the armed conflict in South Sudan are perpetrated by the South Sudanese security forces against the civilian population. In that context there, that is most definitely targeted against a particular ethnic group, that being the ethnic minority of, or the second largest majority of ethnicity being the Nuer people, and also those other minorities that are aligned to them. It is used as a tool to be able to threaten, it displaces civilians. And by displacing civilians as well, what you also do is make society less productive, because not only do you have then people pushed off their lands and a state of chaos reigning, but it also means in those agrarian societies where they rely upon actually tendering the land and living on the land to produce crops, to be able to trade to market and to be able to support their families. When you push people off their lands and you displace them in that way, it obviously makes them less productive in terms of food production, in terms of being able to sustain those necessities of life. And it directly impacts upon those factors of human security that I mentioned earlier, particularly when it comes to things like shelter, reliable food sources, potable water, and indeed it also affects things like healthcare, access to healthcare, and economic opportunity, and so on and so forth as well. So we can see how when we draw upon those impacts, we look to factors of human security, but we also never forget that when we look at armed conflicts, we also look at not only what is the effect, but indeed who is being affected, and that's applying that gender perspective. So when we look at the South Sudan, it is predominantly the use of sexual violence predominantly impacts women and girls, although boys have been known to be targeted for sexual violence as well, but it overwhelmingly targets them. It overwhelmingly targets women who may not be already displaced, but who are certainly left vulnerable as a result of fighting. The second dominant pattern in terms of the use of sexual violence in warfare is as a strategy within an armed group. When I talk about armed groups here, I'll also talk then about the use of it in terms of terrorism. But in terms of an armed group, you can think of Daesh if you want to think of that particular armed group. You can also think about non-state actors in various conflicts in Africa and indeed in Afghanistan and in Iraq and so on and so forth. It can be used as a tool for forced recruitment. The forced recruitment in particular of males or young boys. And what it does is it normalises violence in particular for child soldiers. So an example of this would be when you are going to kidnap young boys from a village, you're going to subsume them into your own armed group and you're going to subject them to acts of sexual violence. So you either force them to commit acts of sexual violence against each other on the basis of a threat to physical violence, or indeed you have men within the group subject them to acts of sexual violence. You may think to yourself, well, why would this happen? In what context does it work? Well, it works in the context of really trying to break the bonds that those young boys would have to the society you've torn them from. If you've taken them from a particular community, they may seek or they will definitely want to return to that community. But there is such a stigma attached to sexual violence, whether it be perpetrated against men, women, boys or girls. But in this case, when it's perpetrated against young boys, those boys may find themselves either unlikely or unwilling to then return to the community that you've taken them from. And indeed, it'll normalise violence in the context of their upbringing. And it'll instill this almost a sense of Stockholm syndrome from those boys to that armed group. So it's particularly effective and particularly used for child soldiers. And it has been noted as a tactic used in conflicts in Africa. It's also used there to instill fear and to terrorise. When we talk about international terrorism, we talk about terrorism as a strategy of terrorism. But this in particular was a very useful tactic that Daesh used in both Syria and in Iraq. And in particular when they were targeting Yazidi peoples is an example of this. The threat of sexual violence and the idea that you know that an armed group is coming to your location, you know that you're unable to defend yourself, you're unable to satisfy that human security factor of physical protection, and indeed that you're likely to be subjected to such abhorrent acts of violence would indeed instill fear, I think, and terrorise anyone. But indeed also the stories of that coming out certainly indicates indicates then to the rest of the world what it is you're about and how you go about treating people. So it does instill fear in that respect there. As a strategy within an armed group as well, I'd also put to you that it can be both a pull and a push factor to the recruitment of people as well. So when I talk about a pull factor, I often talk about the idea of effectively making insurgency sexy. So appealing to particular individuals who may be motivated by the idea that they themselves can receive or can benefit from the spoils of war in many respects there. And so if I point to, for example, the slave markets that were run that sold Yazidi women and other women into sexual slavery that were run by Daesh, and the pull factor that may have had on foreign terrorist fighters in particular who look to join that particular group and be involved in that. But not only the pull factor for foreign terrorist fighters, but also for locals who are thinking about joining that group. Or indeed a push factor. So a push factor being that you join that particular group in order to ensure that your family is then protected and your family becomes off limits for acts of sexual violence that would otherwise have targeted them if you didn't join the armed group. And the third dominant pattern that I'd point to is also as a result of a breakdown of public order. War is chaos, and often as a military professional, you talk about the idea of the fog of war, or the concept of the fog of war. In the context of conflict zones, conflict-affected areas, indeed crisis areas, what you find is generally the absence of order and the breakdown of the necessary functioning components of societies. And this again is particularly true of non-international armed conflict, but is also true of international armed conflict. What this does is this provides the space in which organised crime have the ability to be able to operate, or the freedom of manoeuvre to operate, and they may do so in order to finance armed groups, or they may do so purely for the concept of profit. It facilitates human trafficking, forced prostitution, and sexual slavery. But indeed also sexual violence in this context can also be as a result of opportunistic behaviour, and indeed when perpetrated by security forces or indeed other non-state actors, is generally attributable also to a breakdown in command and control, breakdown in the factors in which an organised military group would exercise command and control over those within its group. So it can be in that context either a strategy of warfare for an armed group where they make a conscious decision to utilise sexual violence to achieve a military or political objective, or indeed an unfortunate byproduct as a result of a breakdown in command and control. The two aren't necessarily a zero-sum game. So the two things can occur in the same actual situation. So if we look at a particular armed conflict, and we think about an armed conflict like the armed conflict in Syria, and we think about the use of a strategy of warfare where sexual violence is perpetrated against people in detention facilities, for example, and there is reports of sexual violence being perpetrated against both men and women, boys and girls, in the context of detention facilities run by the Syrian state. That may be indeed a conscious decision to utilise such a strategy to punish, to terrorise and to instill fear. But at the same time, there may be individuals within that organisation that are opportunistic in their behaviour and take the opportunity to operate in that grey space to indeed perpetrate acts of sexual violence, often because of a belief that they will have impunity, this idea that they will never be held to account for their actions. And it's amazing what people are willing to do or will do when they think nobody's watching. But in that context, I've kind of thrown a few examples out. But let's talk more about then, where does this happen? Not so much in terms of in which conflict situations it happen, but in terms of what locations within a conflict situation are there dominant patterns that show where this occurs. It certainly occurs in the context of fighting in urban areas, in people's homes and in people's villages. It also occurs in detention facilities, and I mentioned earlier detention facilities run by the Syrian regime, where there is confirmed reporting of the use of sexual violence against men, women, boys and girls. It occurs in internally displaced persons camps and refugee camps. So let's just call those protection camps as a catch-all there. It also occurs out in the open, and in the context of South Sudan, one of the ways in which it occurs out in the open, if I provide a practical example, is the requirement for women to collect firewood as a gender norm within that country. And when women go to collect firewood and they leave the safety and security of their home and they move in groups, those groups can be susceptible to being attacked for acts of sexual violence by armed groups who are moving throughout bush and wooded areas. The women are going to collect firewood, or to collect water and so on and so forth, which is one of the gender roles that women have in that society. So it can actually occur out in the open. And indeed, in the context of, for example, fighting in Juba in 2016, in July of that year, it also occurred in the context of vehicle checkpoints being set up around the city and so on and so forth, and the vast numbers of women and the identification of those which were going to be subjected to acts of sexual violence. By soldiers. And in all those contexts there, the one consistent dominant theme there is that the use of sexual violence is always accompanied by the threat or by the use of actual physical harm to individuals. And actually one that I failed to mention that I kind of alluded to earlier was also, we talk about the displacement of people. It also occurs in the context of people who are displaced. And this is not a difficult concept to understand. If you just think about you think about Sweden, or you think about any other country where statistics show that the homeless people are more susceptible to acts of violence because they're living rough and on the streets, and they lack those factors of human security, particularly shelter, particularly access to food, reliable food source, potable water, sanitation, so on and so forth. They're more easily susceptible to acts of violence and indeed to acts of sexual violence. And it's the same for those people who are displaced. So a good practical example of that would be when Turkey invaded Syria late last year and created a 30-kilometre buffer zone in the Syrian Kurdistan region, and the displacement of Kurds in the context of that fighting. People then are then moving south in long droves, and indeed people are more, women and girls in particular, are more susceptible to acts of sexual violence whilst they are displaced and on the move. So in that context there, sexual violence in conflict is both a cause of displacement, but also can result from displacement. And I guess the next question is then, we talked somewhat about this in terms of looking at the strategy as a strategy of warfare, as a strategy with an armed group, and as a result of a breakdown of public order. But the next question becomes, by whom can sexual violence be perpetrated by in an armed conflict? Well, certainly armed groups, whether they be state security forces or whether they be non-state actors, are responsible for a vast amount of the sexual violence perpetrated in the context of armed conflicts. Terrorist organisations, as I mentioned, organised crime, as I mentioned. But one I haven't yet touched on is also, indeed, peacekeeping forces as well. And so in that context there, what we talk about is sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and when, for example, UN peacekeepers or NATO peacekeepers would indeed be responsible for acts of sexual violence in the context of conflict. Some practical examples of that would be allegations of against French soldiers in Mali for the trading of rations for sexual favours from host nation women. Indeed, the pedophile ring run by Bangladeshi troops as part of the UN forces in Haiti, where 136 Bangladeshi soldiers were implicated over a significant period, having effectively trafficked 9 young children into a pedophile ring over a period of approximately 10 years. And indeed, just more broadly in Haiti, there is a term in Haitian Creole refers effectively to a municipal baby because of the vast amount of relationships that existed between UN peacekeepers and local women, and as a result, children were born, and so they are known as municipal babies. That again represents an issue of sexual violence. Now you may think to yourself, how does that really work? how do we talk then about sexual exploitation and sexual abuse in the context of armed conflict when we're talking about peacekeepers? What I'm getting at here is effectively that there is indeed a power imbalance between peacekeepers and indeed a host nation population. Host nation populations in the context of conflict, and as a result of a breakdown of public order, as a result of a breakdown of those aspects of society that would normally sustain people, threats to their human security, particularly access to reliable food sources, potable water, sanitation, again, physical security may be an aspect, so on. But you're looking to satisfy those basic Maslow needs. People will seek to do that. And indeed, when a peacekeeping force is there and a peacekeeping force is logistically sustained and well kept in the field and has the ability then, or has a power imbalance over local population, which may be struggling to satisfy those needs, in that respect, there will be there perhaps is a turn to prostitution, or alternatively just the forming of relationships. But there is a power imbalance in that relationship, and indeed, I would like to point out as well that the United Nations has a zero tolerance policy on sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. Clearly, we've seen in instances throughout the last 10 to 15 years that these things do occur. Well, I've talked a lot about trying to draw out some dominant patterns there now, and looked at sort of define sexual violence in the context of armed conflict for you. Albeit, I realise not everyone's a lawyer, so some of that stuff. If I could, in all honesty, I'd be happy to talk about this for a long, long time. But there are probably people who are more interested in actually being able to ask questions of me and receive some feedback. But before I go to that, I just want to talk to you about where do we think we can go from here, because it's all well and good to talk about the doom and gloom of sexual violence in the context of armed conflict. It's all well and good to point out how we define sexual violence, to look at it from a gender perspective, to consider aspects of human rights and indeed humanitarian principles, to understand that sexual violence disproportionately affects women, although it does indeed also impact men and boys. But it's also important to understand where we can go to from here. The first thing for those who are students is that I point you to is actually a toolkit that's been produced by UN Women and also the OSCE Office for the Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. And this toolkit is a gender and security toolkit. What I will do is I will provide a link to that, and I'll give that to Muriel so that she can put that up onto the Malmö Association of Foreign Affairs Facebook page, so you can actually have a look at that for those who are interested. But this particular toolkit is very useful, and it looks to break down indeed an understanding of gender and security. I'll also provide a second toolkit that's been produced. Actually, there's an academic at the Swedish Defence University, and he's led a push to be able to develop a toolkit as well when it comes to gender in the military. And I'll provide a link to the toolkit for gender in the military as well. Other resources that I point you to is certainly resources both that are provided by NATO, UN Women, and UN Women, UN Security Council resolutions 1325 and 1820 are the ones I've talked about here, but there are indeed 10 resolutions that relate to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And so if you just jump in Google and just put in UN Security Council Resolution 1325, you'll be able to bring up all of the relative resolutions that are there. But they effectively are driving the agenda that, as I said, is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. And the other key thing I would point you to as well is to be able to link the Women, Peace and Security agenda to the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. And I touched upon that at the beginning of the lecture, but I just want to come back to that for a second and just talk about those Sustainable Development Goals for you. I'd point you in the direction of Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which is about gender equality. And at the end of the day, when we talk about applying the women, peace and security agenda, when we look at the integration of women into issues of peace and security, when we look at recognising that fundamental to achieving international peace and security is indeed the inclusion of women, we look at those sort of sustainable development goals as being complementary activities to that women, peace and security agenda. Sustainable Development Goal number 16 is also relevant in this context, which talks about peaceful, just and inclusive societies. And I would also put to you as well the Sustainable Development Goal number 17, which is about sustainable development in and of itself, is also important in terms of the broader women, peace and security agenda, but also in terms of addressing some of those human security needs that may indeed address issues of armed conflict. I'd also like to articulate that, that in this context, when it comes to sexual violence in armed conflict, when it comes to sexual violence more broadly, when it comes to the women, peace and security agenda, this is an issue in which the voices of women are paramount, but it's also an issue in which men have to take a stand as well. And in this context, the women, peace and security agenda, although titled that, is an issue, as I've mentioned several times, about gender equality, but it's a human issue. And it's an issue that every single person should be taking an interest in, and particularly those who have an interest in foreign affairs